You here in the room as well as those online. My name is Anders Jägerskog. I work for the World Bank. I'm the program manager for a trust fund called Cooperation in International Waters in Africa, and also Transboundary water focal point globally for the World Bank. And it's my pleasure today to moderate and chair this very interesting session. And I'm glad this year that CV is focusing on groundwater. This is, in a way, not least if you think about transboundary. We have agreements on rivers often, not enough. There's still more that can be done there. But if you look at transboundary groundwater, there are very few frameworks and agreements on transboundary water. So this is an area where we will increase our focus. And this is also an area where I think everyone should increase their focus. So it's our pleasure to dig a little bit deeper into this topic here today and see how cooperation and conflict over transboundary groundwater looks. And we have a distinguished panel. We have a keynote from a colleague over here that would set the scene. But before that, I'd like to hand over to the new global director for global practice. I think there's an echo going on here. Can we? Okay, it's gone. Mr. Sarosh Kumarja, who is, well, before his appointment as director for water, he was the World Bank's regional director in the Middle East department. He was also senior director for fragility, conflict, and violence at the World Bank, as well as the World Bank's regional director for Central Asia when he was based in Almaty. Of course, the CV is longer, but I'll stop there and hand over to you, Sarosh, for some introductory remarks. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Good. Okay. So good morning, everyone. As Anders said, I've just started my new job. This is my 4th week, so please pardon me if I say something that you already know, okay? So one thing that, as in my introduction, you may have gathered, that I follow the crisis. Maybe I create crisis and then I follow it, because I was senior director for fragile states covering fragility, conflict, and violence in the World Bank in Washington. And more recently, I was regional director for the Middle East, covering Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, a group of lovely countries based in Lebanon. So I want to make 4 points as you begin the discussion on transboundary groundwater cooperation. First, the World Bank perspective. So right from the very beginning, the World Bank has a policy. It's called Operations Policy 7.5. It makes it mandatory for the World Bank, even while looking at the groundwater issues, that we engage with all the countries which share a common source of groundwater. So it's been very much a part of our policy that not just for surface water, but also for groundwater, we would reach out to all the countries which are part of the same source of groundwater. So I think it's very important that we are talking about today, this very important topic. And you'll hear this later in the meeting, I guess, that the World Bank is coming up with a global flagship report on groundwater this year. What is the timeline for the launch of this report?
I think it's in the spring sometime.
So I think it'll be a very important report to provide lots of initial kind of assessment and the way forward in terms of how should we be really working on groundwater. My second point is on cooperation, essentially for peace, stability dimension. And I just said, since I was in the Middle East for 5 years, I have seen it firsthand, how water is really driving instability, low intensity conflicts. I've seen it firsthand. Traveling to different parts of Iraq and other countries in the region, you can see firsthand the competition over very limited resources, including water, how this is creating tension between communities. And this has nothing to do with confession. Many of us who come from Middle East in this group, you'll feel it's about confession, whether you are Christian, you are a Shia, you are a Sunni. It has a lot to do with access to resources for survival, for livelihoods. And this is very much driving some of the low intensity conflicts. So more cooperation between communities, between states, between governments, between think tanks who are part of the common, what we call the treasure, as you're saying, hidden treasure, I think is extremely important for peace and stability. And we'll hear this more, I guess, in the next hour or so in this discussion. I strongly believe that the discussion on groundwater cooperation among countries would be very much part of our broader thinking on transboundary cooperation for building a more stable and peaceful world. It is extremely important. And the third point I wanted to make is the whole discussion on climate. The discourse that is happening in the climate debate, COP26, now COP27 in the Arab region, and COP28 again in Arab region next year, I think it is very important that the water community tries to bring in what I would call the better understanding of why it is important to address groundwater challenges as part of the broader climate adaptation and mitigation discussion. I see that element to be extremely under-profiled, under-analyzed. Most climate documents are very weak on groundwater, very weak or non-existent, actually. So we have to do a better job as a community to really put groundwater discussion as part of that debate, especially when the COP27 or the COP26 or the whole Paris Agreement was a document negotiated among all member countries, many of which share their source of groundwater. So it's very important that we put this in the context of climate, because it is not enough for just water people to talk to each other and say why groundwater is so important and we should cooperate, because that is not going to help us really realize what our goals are. And my last point is on the whole economic growth. End of the day, it's all about creating jobs. It's all about countries to grow. It's all about better quality of lives for our people where we work, for the governments, for the society, for the economies. We should be able to make a case that if the countries cooperate on groundwater, common sources of groundwater across national boundaries, it's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win. And we should be able to demonstrate, based on very rigorous economic analysis, that there is net plus when countries come together. And one thing I was mentioning yesterday to Anders when I was meeting the Nile Basin Initiative colleagues is that what I would call the optimization scenario. So a scenario where you do nothing, business as usual, each country is doing the way they're managing the groundwater, and you project the economic models of those countries to see how will these economies grow if everything else remains as they are. And second scenario, where we introduce policy changes through cooperation and see how does the economy of these countries perform going forward. My assumption is that you will see net increase because of countries coming together and having a better understanding on management of groundwater resources across boundaries. We got to be able to make that case. My intuition is that will be the case. We do not have enough economic data to make this case. And if you don't make that case, it's very hard for us to explain to ministers of finance, ministers of foreign affairs, and of course to the senior political leadership. Why? Because often it is seen as losing sovereign interests and rights if you have to cooperate across borders. So we got to be able to make that economic case, because more cooperation across transboundary groundwater means better economic growth, more jobs for young people in this region. And we, the water community, have a responsibility to be able to bring in that evidence, that knowledge. And I can commit to you that the World Bank would like to be part of such an effort. Next year, we are in the initial stages, because I started my job. We will be coming up with a big report on economics of water, a world water report on essentially looking at water in the context of economic growth. And I think there will be opportunity for us to have more discussion during the few days that I'm here. But if you have ideas, please reach out. I'm extending my hands on behalf of the World Bank to all of you in this room and outside to work together because this is a huge agenda, and I really want the World Bank to be very much part of the international community's effort to make this change happen. Thank you very much. Over to you, Anders.
Thank you so much, Saroj, for those introductory remarks and really setting the stage and providing the context for World Bank engagement, but also broader what is important on this topic. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Stefan Döring, who is a researcher with the Research School on International Water Cooperation at the Department of Peace and Conflict in Uppsala. And he will talk about some very interesting research that was part of his PhD. And you were one of the PhD students of the research school that started a few years back. So we're excited to have you here, and the floor is yours. Please, you have 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much. So again, as Anders said, I'm a conflict researcher. So I'm sort of, at my department, I'm the water person, but I guess when I'm here, I'm the conflict person. But just to see sort of what my starting point is. So I'll just very briefly give you an overview about the research I have done and a bit about the research that's ongoing and that I'm planning to do. And a lot of what I'm talking about has to do with sort of the low intensity type of conflicts. So not so much interstate, but I'm going to explain a little bit why I think that's important. Also, I'm sorry, I see some people in the room who have seen versions of my presentation also before. So something that I think is like in the now 6 years or so that I've been working on water issues, especially on groundwater, I see that in academia or like in academic research, we pretty much neglect more subnational approaches in water sharing. And there's much more focus on surface water, especially for the interstate relations. And also for more the low intensity conflicts within states, there's much more focus on rainfall or drought measures. So something that doesn't really happen so much in the literature is to look at groundwater. I'm also right now preparing a review that's, I think, coming out at the end of the year or the beginning of the year, where I'm also systematically show that there's much less research also on groundwater. In my research, I have shown, just to sum it up right away, that water scarcity, and especially groundwater, can be a direct source of low-scale conflict, sort of like these, we call them communal conflicts. So these are like non-organized groups, and not just like through these what they call mediating factors. So these, like other research has shown that, for example, drought can lead to conflict if other things are also visible. But in some of the research that I show that groundwater actually also given other factors can explain conflict. And by that, I mean more hardly or more difficult accessible groundwater. I also, at the same time, I have other research that shows more hard accessible groundwater is also a source of cooperation. And especially on domestic water related issues. So when the state is not involved, we actually see more cooperation, which is may sound like a little bit counterintuitive. And I also have done other research on more individual levels, like using surveys, where I actually show that when people are exposed to water scarcity or drought, they're actually less cooperative on an individual level. But at the same time, I show that within a certain group, like for example, confession, what you said, but I see when people identify with another group, they're actually more cooperative. And what that research shows also is that we see different types of cooperation between individual level, group level, organizational level, up to the state level. And they might not always be in harmony. And that often we see that institutions are, for example, very important places where people come together and that facilitate cooperation at different levels. This is a study I think I have first presented here 5 years ago. It's now published in a journal. But this is just, again, like to wrap up, in this study, I show that the depth to groundwater is related to conflicts. And like, so the deeper access to groundwater is the more likely I see these types of conflicts, so-called communal conflicts. Which I have looked at in Africa and the Middle East, although you see on the lower right panel that it's much more phenomena of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. Just moving on, this is a study that's also published in a journal of Global Environmental Change. And here I looked at water cooperation, which is defined in a certain data set. I can explain all these like nitty-gritty methods questions later, but unfortunately I don't have time for that here. But basically I measure different types of cooperation between actors that are not the state. And I also see that access to like lower access to groundwater facilitates cooperation. And I've even looked in this, like, so this is the exact opposite if you think from my other study, right? But I don't think it's like counterintuitive. Like, so there are, if we measure instances of conflict, like if that's our goal, then we that's all we measure, right? But if we measure cooperation, then that's only how we're able to do this. And a lot of research hasn't done that. And I even show on the upper right panel that here I've plotted instances of violence. And over that, I plotted instances of cooperation. I actually see a lot of cooperation in places that have seen violence, which is probably also shows that, so let's say there is a problem about groundwater, and in some places it creates conflict, but then it actually in the long run, we see more cooperation. And that's probably also why we see more focus by NGOs and other places to settle these. But in itself, I think it's a really interesting finding. Now, just very briefly, so I'm going to start a new project that's funded by the Swedish Research Council, and I'm doing the opposite now, which is I'm looking at the effect of water scarcity after conflicts, and what does that mean for post societies. And here it's a little bit of, some of this is maybe not as direct related to this topic, but I'm also interested in like how ecosystems affected by exposure to violence, as well as general health, mental issues. I think this would give a better underlying, can provide better underlying stories for when we see, or we have water scarcity and it leads to conflict, but what happens then, right? What's the effect then on society? And I even look at the role of integrated water resource management, which is some preliminary study that I have done right now. And I see, for example, that countries that have higher implementation of IWRM are also more peaceful. So here I plotted. So peacefulness, it's a little bit counterintuitive. One is most peaceful up to least peaceful, and then higher scores of IWRM. And I see that countries that have better implementation are more peaceful. And I've also controlled this with other variables later, since it's just a two-variable approach. I actually wanted to show some preliminary research on interstate water cooperation around groundwater, but I actually did not find very good data sets. So I will need to work more on this and find better data sources. Something that I wanted to say, because like IWRM, like, yes, it does correlate with lots of other indices, like for economic development and things like that. So I think something that's really interested as the next step is to disaggregate this a little bit more, and perhaps even in types of water, like rivers, other surface water, and groundwater. So I was asked to put up directions for policy and research, but I often think like academics shouldn't say so much about policy. So I'm trying to do my best at like bringing these together. I think that something that I largely see is that groundwater is still neglected by researchers, but as we just heard, as well as by certain policy. There is this, this like literature on water wars. Even that literature doesn't really talk much about groundwater, even though I have like some reservations about that literature in general. And like something that I think is very important is that often where it goes as a conflict researcher, they're like, oh, tell me about how like water scarcity is a cause for conflict. But I think it's probably even more interesting to look into water scarcity as a potential for peaceful actions or cooperation, because that we also see. And then I think what's really a key message that I just want everyone to take away with is that I think it's really important to look at different levels of governance, like at individual, group, sub-basin units, also like within river basins and state level, and like to address these and see what the interactions are. Because if we only look at interstate relations, like there are very important things that happen in a river basin, for example, that have maybe not so much to do with interstate relations. And that's all I wanted to say, just as a very quick keynote. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Excellent to see the research that you're presenting, and I think we're here today having a mix of research and policy. And this is also, as Sarosh highlighted, we need to understand more. This is part of it, and there's more to be done, both on the economic side, but also on the peace and conflict side. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you a panel, a distinguished panel, I'd like to say, where we're going to have a bit of a back and forth. And if you have questions, please note them down, because there will be Q&A towards the end, a facilitated one. And I think, or I'm also saying that for those online, I think you can submit them through the Zoom link as well. And they will be captured and curated by Elise, who will lead that Q&A. But I'm pleased to welcome the panel up. You know who you are, Sonia Koppel, who is the secretary of the UNECE Water Convention. Please join me here upstage. And then we have Susanne Schmeier, who is an associate professor of water law and diplomacy at UNESCO IG, the Netherlands. We have Mr. Lenka Tamé, who is the executive secretary of the Orasicom, or Orange Sanko River Commission, based in South Africa. We also have, let me make space over here for at least one of you. We also have Mr. Abdelkader Dodo, who is the coordinator for water resources in the Sahara and Sahel Observatory, the OSS, who is joining online. Just wanted to confirm that he's there and can hear us. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up. Great. So I'm going to ask you some questions that you're aware of, and then we are going to listen to your responses to that. And then hopefully I can have a bit of a back and forth. So please keep your answer relatively short in the interest both of time, but also in terms of interaction. So I'm going to start with you, Sonia. What is UNECE's experience in facilitating cooperation over shared aquifers and groundwater?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. As you probably have heard, globally, there are 592 aquifers which are shared by 2 or more countries, according to UNESCO IGRAC database. And the second reporting on the SDG indicator 6.5.2 on transboundary cooperation, which UNESCO and UNECE as co-custodian agencies have carried out, has showed that there is a huge lack of information on shared aquifers and way too little cooperation, as it was already mentioned earlier on. So, for example, the global average for the indicator is based on data, in this case from 94 countries, is 42 compared to 64 for surface water. So it really shows that we have to do a lot of work on transboundary groundwaters. And globally, only 24 countries have all their transboundary surface and groundwaters covered by operational arrangements for water cooperation. So in order to address this challenge, we need to upscale capacity development. We need to address data gaps, particularly on groundwater. We need to mobilize political will and also strengthen legal frameworks and capitalize on existing ones, such as the draft articles on transboundary groundwater and the 2 United Nations Global Water Conventions. So the UNECE, the Water Convention, Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Water Courses and International Lakes, which I'm representing, is particularly important in this regard because it covers both transboundary surface and transboundary groundwaters, those which are connected to surface water and also those which are not connected to surface waters. And transboundary waters has been high on the agenda of the transboundary groundwater has been high on the agenda of the Water Convention for the last decades. On the one hand, the Water Convention provides common ground rules for cooperation. So, for example, in 2012, were developed and adopted model provisions on transboundary groundwaters by the meeting of the parties of the Water Convention, which specify how to apply the convention to groundwaters, which give inspiration to countries on how to draft agreements on groundwaters, which provisions to include them. And they were developed in an intergovernmental process with countries from all over the world. But even more importantly, the Water Convention also provides a platform to facilitate dialogue and actually promote action on the ground. So, for example, in our work on monitoring and assessment, the first and second assessment on transboundary groundwaters transboundary waters cover both surface and groundwaters in 2007 and also 2011. They assessed actually the different groundwaters all over the pan-European region. But then, as I said, the Water Convention also promotes and supports application and cooperation on groundwater in specific basins upon request and upon demand from the countries. So, for example, in our work on the water, food, energy ecosystem nexus, we have been assessing interrelation between different sectors in 7 basins worldwide, and one of them is groundwater. So on the Northwest Sahara Aquifer system, together with DWP Med and OSS, we have been supporting an intersectoral assessment and trade-offs between the different sectors, which was finalized in 2020. And then just a few years ago, when Senegal joined the Water Convention in 2018, Senegal realized that cooperation on transport of surface water was obviously very much advanced with OMVS, OMVG, etc. But on transboundary groundwater, they did almost not have any cooperation yet. So they asked the Water Convention Secretariat and Geneva Water Hub to support cooperation on the Senegal-Mauritanian Aquifer Basin, which is it is an aquifer shared between Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, and Mauritania, in order to develop an agreement and set up a joint cooperative framework on this groundwater. So in a 2-3 years process, financed by also the Swiss Development Corporation and European Union, the countries have worked together, have set up a regional working group to manage this groundwater, have developed a joint action plan, and with our support then developed and signed a memorandum of understanding between the ministers from those 4 countries last year at the meeting of the parties of the Water Convention, in order to, with a commitment to really develop an agreement and set up a joint management mechanism. And that also includes the development of a project which is now being considered for financing by several donors, including, for example, the World Bank. Here the existing basin organizations, namely OMVS, which we have here also today, but also OMVG for the Gambia, are very closely involved and will actually eventually be hosting, or will be, are really the driving forces also, since they already exist for a long term there. Other institutions such as OSS, such as others, are also obviously very much involved. And this is just one example of where the Water Convention, on the one hand, has inspired actions, has actually identified the need, in this case by Senegal, and has brought the countries together, which on the other hand then, together with other actors, which then has also afterwards, for example, facilitated accession, in this case by Guinea-Bissau, to the Water Convention, and the Gambia is also already in the very final steps. So this is just one example of where we have been supporting transboundary cooperation on the groundwater basin. And I'm happy to share more information and lessons learned if you have time during the discussions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sonia. And I think this is an exciting example of cooperation between the convention, the countries, and also exciting that there is movement and traction on transboundary groundwaters in Africa. So it's now my pleasure to introduce and hand over to Mr. Dodo. So yes, perfect. Now everyone can see you. Welcome to the session, Mr. Dodo. We're glad to have you. And I wonder if you could briefly describe the Sahara and Sahel Observatory 2030 strategy.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me share my my PowerPoint presentation. Do you see my presentation?
Possible?
Hello?
Yes, we see. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me go to the. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I thank World Bank for inviting OSS to to this so relevant side event about groundwater. I would like to share with you our activities on regional cooperation through OSA strategy 2021-2030 and our key roles. OSS, Saharan Sahel Observatory, is an international organization based in Tunis, Tunisia since 1982. And as you see, we have 26 member states in North Africa, West, Central Africa, East Africa, and also we have in the Northern Europe. And also you have Canada in, how do you say, America. And we have some organization, NGO, we have some river basin organization, and so on. Our mission is to support an African member countries in the sustainable management of natural resources, in particularly disadvantageous climate changes. And our roles or our services is to be a platform for North-South and the South-South partnership, to come as an interface for science and the policy linkage, and to be a collaborative tools made available to the countries in order, to assist them to accompany the challenge they are facing. OSS is working based on a decade strategy. Initially, we have the 2010, and after we have 2020, and now we have 2030, the strategy. And this strategy, in line with international initiative, SDGs, and regional initiatives such as Agenda 2063, you have African Water Vision is going to end. You have another initiative. And in line with this, our aim is to support our member countries in the implementation of the sustainable development policies. This strategy is lead to this big, important scientific and technical program we call Integrate and Coordinate Management of Natural Resources. It consists of 4 major programs: water, land, biodiversity, and the climate. Me, I have in charge, to lead the water department. And I have a cross-cutting program, watch and perspective, communication and information, and capacity building. For each program, you have strategic objective and some operational objective. Among other operational objectives, we have in water, improving knowledge of surface and groundwater resources, implementing planning tools for water resource management, providing support to integrate and sustainable management policy in the water resource, and of course, improving and sustaining governance for shared water resources. In land aspect, you have managing land and ecosystem. In climate change, you have good resilience for population, the ecosystem, and of course, supporting country for access to climate change. OSA is an entity for adaptation fund and the GCF. This strategy is 2030 strategy was adopted during the last General Assembly of Sources held last 2020 in November in Tunis. And after this relevant document, we elaborate the log frame. As you see an example, you have only for water. And then for each strategic objective, we develop, all the major indicators. But to be realistic, you have, for instance, the 2 operational objectives. But for this domain, you have 4 operational objectives. Here we start by the baseline value from 2021, And our target is 2030, of course. And we try our best because, you know, OSS is an international organization, but the financial contribution comes mainly from the countries. And of course, the project we're developing to answer to countries' requests. And we develop also, you know, the action plan. First, we prepare from 2022 to 2025, because we have our, in each 4 years, we have our General Assembly. And then next 2025, we have our General Assembly. This is why we know we divide by 2 our action plan. And for each operational objective, as you see, we develop the major activities. Of course, from activity, we'll move to task, and we have the timeline. And we try to see who will be responsible, the person, material cost, and so on. What is really, really important about this? You know, OSS in the water domain is working mainly in transboundary aspect, in transboundary aquifer systems. Of course, we have also the surface. And we try our best, you know, to develop the conjunctive management where we have surface and groundwater linkage. Of course, the African continent has a lot of aquifer systems, more than 80 transboundary aquifer systems. And our key roles to integrate at the regional level, you know, the countries, is really to strengthen the transboundary cooperation, especially in transboundary waters, to avoid conflicts between sectors. Of course, you have agriculture, you have mining, you have water supply and so on, but how they can work together. And between water users, of course, this is mainly at local level. But if the aquifer or share, we must take care. And that's why we develop some important tools such as transboundary combined model, groundwater model, and to see how we can work with or basin organization. Our roles is, I would like just to give 2 important roles. We like to improve the integrated and concerted management of water, surface and groundwaters, because it's not possible to see you have only groundwaters. Perhaps in the north part, for instance, Saharan Sahel aquifer system, where you have only groundwater, because in this area you have really a desert. You have few recharge. It is a fossil water. And we encourage the establishment of consultation mechanism. This is a kind of water management framework for transboundary aquifer system at technical and political levels. In the country, we have the EMBO, African Network of Organization Basin, but you have few for groundwater. In the world, more than 600 transboundary aquifer systems were identified to UNESCO, according to Jeff Finance and World Bank, of course. And if you consider this 600 aquifer system, you have only 7 aquifer systems in the world which has an consultation mechanism or framework to manage well their water resources. This is why, for us, you know, in the right hand, you have the African continent, you have the aquifer who are managing. For instance, in the blue, this is what is ongoing. For instance, Sonja discussed about, you know, the Senegalo aquifer system, you know, here. And in the another blue, you have the Northwestern Sahara aquifer system shared by Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia. And in the western part, you have the Illuminated Taudi aquifer system shared by 7 countries: Algeria, Benin, Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and Nigeria. And of course, we have Nigeria crossing this important transboundary aquifer system. And we develop through our model the linkage, and we identify that Niger River is supporting is supplying groundwater in the upstream, and the downstream you have groundwater supporting the Niger River. Is you have a close linkage. This is why we're moving to the conjunctive management. But you know, in Africa, I have more than 80 aquifer systems, but less than 6 or 7 aquifer systems were really completed. This is very, very important, the big challenges. This is why OSS is developing a major transboundary project. It is very, very important, you know, to see how we can invite the countries, you know, to do together, you know, in inclusive approach, there's some action to think about the best way, you know, the best practice to first to know very well what is happening from bottom up, what's going about, you know, the groundwater flow patterns and the linkage with the surface. And of course, we develop a major cooperation with the Basin Organization. This is why in 2012, OSS received the King Hassan II Great World Water Prize at Marseille during the World Water Forum in Marseille. This is really our aim, you know, how we can support, how we can accompany, how we can assist, you know, the countries to really manage well in this sustainable way, you know, the transboundary aquifer. Now we're working with the great green world, because in this area you have the Sahel area is so arid. The major resource they have is, you know, of course, groundwater. Thank you very much for us.
Mr. Dodo, for this extensive presentation and really showing that there is a lot that still needs to be done. We know that focus has largely been over the last decades on the surface water, if we talk about transboundary, and there are many river basin organizations. So, Susanne, I would like to ask you, what is in your view, the role of river basin organization in groundwater management? To you.
Well, thanks, Anders. I think there's a lot of things that we have learned from how to manage river basins or lake basins or surface water that we can apply to groundwater. I'll go a little bit more into detail, but I think the key message is, and it's a message that we very urgently actually have to apply to shared aquifers, is that we do need institutionalized cooperation at the basin so far, but of course also at the aquifer level, right? It was mentioned earlier that ultimately, why are we cooperating over our shared waters, be they surface or groundwaters, is because we want to generate jobs, we want to support the environment, we want to make sure these resources are being managed in a sustainable way, supporting today's and tomorrow's populations. And for that, we have to take a step beyond a momentary commitment of cooperation. Yeah, countries can say in a facilitated way or just among themselves, hey, let's cooperate over the resources we have. They might even move ahead and sign an agreement. And we do have now more than 700 agreements over surface waters, but very, very few over groundwaters only. But even that might often not enough. How many agreements are there that just sit on the shelf in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs somewhere? So taking that next step and really institutionalizing cooperation is something that I believe is very important, that we've seen in surface water and that we should now take in the groundwater field as well. Someone needs to ensure that countries share data, that there's a joint monitoring, which is even more difficult for groundwaters than for surface waters, that management plans are being developed, that there's a discussion among the countries what insights from joint monitoring, for example, mean for withdrawals, for the use of the resources. But ultimately, there might be, or there will for sure be, disagreements again over how a resource is being managed. And the dispute resolution mechanisms that institutions responsible for a basin or for an aquifer provide are really crucial for that. And I think that's really a lesson we can draw, that we need to manage at the resource levels through institutionalized cooperation. But then if we look at reality, it actually looks quite bad for aquifers. A few numbers have been mentioned. We have these more than 500 aquifers, but there are very, very few treaties. We can also look at basin organizations that might play a role in conjunctive management if the aquifer is connected to the surface basin. But even there are only 8 basin organizations that have groundwater formally in their mandate, in the agreement that establishes the organization. There are a handful more that don't necessarily have the word in their agreement, but work on it. We've heard OMVS before. We'll hear something on the orange. But generally, this is still very, very few if we think about more than 500 aquifers, right? If you want to compare the ratio, there are more than 300 surface water basins, but we have more than 130 basin organizations that deal with those. So the ratio is just a bit off. And then I think to take it one step further, and that's maybe very, very optimistic, I think we also need to make sure that these institutions, once they're established, another lesson from basin organizations, indeed also work effectively, right? If they don't function properly, that's when we'll see conflict, very local level conflict, slow onset conflict, or outright water disputes, as we've seen, let's say, over the Nile in Central Asia. You know all the places, right? And what we've certainly learned from surface water, and that I think is even more applicable for groundwaters, is that if the institution is not able to deal with the rate of change that happens over the resource, that's when conflicts occur. And I think the basin organizations that are there can play a key role in managing the groundwaters that are connected to their basins, although there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to actually establish where something is connected or not. So a lot more research needs to be done there. But then we also must not forget those aquifers that do not have an institution that lends itself kind of naturally, such as OMVS or also Orasicom, to deal with the groundwater that's in the region. And that, I think, is a key challenge over the next years. Thanks, Anders.
Okay, thank you so much, Susanne. You provided us a lot of detailed and important information and perspectives on RBOs and their potential role in transboundary groundwater management. But let's hear now from Lenka Tamer, who is working for an RBO. And if you could briefly describe Orasicom's work on shared aquifers.
Yes, facilitator, and thank you very much for the opportunity to say a couple of words of support and contribution to the groundwater discussion. Just to say that the Orange Senku River Basin is located in Southern Africa. It involves 4 countries, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa. But when it comes to the topic particularly of groundwater, as it was mentioned before, I think maybe it appears as a line in the agreement. With some of my colleagues here, I will keep on looking at them. Maybe as a line in the agreement, but the Orasicom, or what we call the Orasicom agreement, is really a drawdown from a regional framework, which we call the SADC Protocol on Shared Water Courses. There is a lot of emphasis on surface water, but groundwater is sort of implied, and there is some qualification of what kind of groundwater we are speaking about. I think we talk about the terminus, which is something like common terminus, which is something like groundwater meeting with surface water at some point. So there is classifications even within that regional framework of what kind of groundwater is included. Now, we have a special case of a transboundary aquifer, which is shared by Namibia on the other one side, Botswana, as well as South Africa. It's like a corner, an area of a corner. But that area is also typically very dry. It's part of, I think, the Kalahari desert, and then that translates typically to communities they're relying substantially on groundwater for all kinds of purposes. Our scientists, I will point at him because he's here, they tell us that some of the big challenges in that area, of course I know about them, is the fact that we are depleting the groundwater quicker than it's being replenished. Salination or salinity is a very big challenge in that area, and also pollution. I think it's as a result of, very quick drawdowns on the groundwater, very little replenishment and human use and the wastewater and all other elements. And broadly, accessibility to water by the communities, whether it's for domestic water use or is for other purposes, all the way including sanitation, because there's really no other source of fresh water in the area. So this is one special case where you find that on the Namibia side, because of other support which they had previously, there's been very extensive drilling of very deep wells and quite substantial research on the aquifer and its characteristics on that side. On the Botswana side, yes, I know there is quite extensive drilling, but I don't think as much effort it was possible to put as much effort into the research of the aquifer and so on that side. And also on the South Africa side, yes, the aquifer is being used, but the amount of research, again, is not as much, especially on the very deep aquifers, which happen to be the advantage on the Namibia side. On this aquifer I'm speaking about, which is called the Stampriet aquifer. Now, we know we are water people in Southern Africa. I don't want to speak about Orascom yet, but we know that UNESCO has been very active in the region, especially working on groundwater, and they have conducted a number of studies on groundwater, especially in that zone. I know the bulk of the financing was coming from the Swiss Development Corporation. But ultimately, the three countries, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, decided that they would like to cooperate more formally on the Stampriet aquifer system, which is a transboundary system. And they decided to establish a governance structure called a multi-country cooperation mechanism. I'm more used to the MCCM, so I also have to read what I have to say. But they decided to establish this MCCM. The proposal was discussed by the countries. I think this was around 2016. Yes, it's 2016. And the countries decided that, look, because this aquifer system already lies within the geographic space of the Orange River Basin, let's anchor it under the Orascom. The formal term used was nesting. So the MCCM, or this multi-country cooperation mechanism of the Stampriet aquifer, has been anchored on the Orange River Commission, which is the basin-wide agreement, which also extends to Lesotho. So what that means practically in terms of us, in terms of the Secretariat, and in terms of the structures of Orascom, is that the groundwater committee, which I want to call an expert group today, just for simplicity, gives the technical oversight on the actions of under this MCCM and makes provides supervision, so to speak, over the work that is being conducted. Most of the work has to do with understanding the aquifer system, monitoring the aquifer system, and sharing information on the aquifer system. I just wanted to share, without going into detail, that they recently, this mechanism, as well as the groundwater expert group of Orascom, recently just completed a strategic action plan for the Stampriet aquifer, which then defines a number of actions and objectives and initiatives that they would like to pursue while trying to strengthen cooperation and governance and management of the groundwater system in this regard. Some of the lessons which I really wanted to pick on, just two, to say that, skills are still slightly difficult in terms of availability in the space of groundwater. But what one has seen is that countries such as Botswana have actually gone out of the way to bring in expertise and skills from the university. So a researcher from the university in Botswana is actually part of the technical expert team on the Stamford, just to provide additional contribution to what the government is able to provide through the department. But what still remains a challenge, even to us, the Secretariat, trying to mobilize funding and so on, is that drilling boreholes, which are really the fundamental and basic element of managing or understanding groundwater, is very costly. So that remains a very big challenge to us on better understanding the aquifers and also ensuring that there is effective joint management of aquifers, especially the transboundary one. I would like to stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lenka, for this explanation of how an RBO can actually work, and is already working on an aquifer, whether linked. So, and I mean, I didn't know all the details. So it's exciting to hear how this is developing. But we've heard some of the examples here, embryonic in many ways, and there's so much more to do. I'm sure you all have lots of questions, both in the room but also online. And I will now hand over, panel, please stay, to Elise Serrat, who is Environmental Affairs Officer at UNEC, who will moderate the Q&A. I will come back towards the end. So over to you, Elise.
Anders, and good morning. Exactly. My name is Elise Serrat, working for the Water Convention Secretariat. And now is really your time to ask any burning questions you have. I would like to, first of all, remind you maybe of the ground rules. If you have a question, please identify yourself. Please say which panelist or keynote speaker you would like to raise your question to. And please speak up so everybody, also our online participants, can hear you. So with that, I would like to open the floor. We've heard a lot already, and I think there is probably some question in the room. Anybody? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Sporting Gamo from Ethiopia. I would like to make a very clear point on these two issues.
And I hope it's also going to be a question.
Yes.
Okay, good.
To bring my question to you. Now, I think we are talking about the river basin and the groundwater within that basin. And don't forget, there are transboundary rivers which are flowing from one country to another country, where we are almost using the water system which is flowing in that basin. When we are talking about groundwater within that basin, there is the issue of sovereignty there. When we are defining that one, I think we have to look at this political implications also, really to bring it together. That's what.
Okay, would anybody like to react to this? Yeah, please go ahead.
I'll give it a try, although it's not necessarily, there's an echo. It's not necessarily going to be an answer, but maybe just reconfirming that what you said is very important. I mean, there are political issues that come into play, which is why having institutionalized cooperation is so important. That was one of the points I was making, right? There might be times where countries agree to cooperate and maybe even enter into a formal agreement, but political tides change, as we all know, and there are basins in the world where we've seen that. So having something that is more long-term there and ensures the cooperation is important. But yeah, you referred to basins or to situations where
basins and aquifers to some extent coincide. But there are many where that's not entirely the case. I mean, think of Orasicom, 3 of the 4 countries sharing the Stamford River. 1 more country being part of Orasicom, maybe still an ideal situation in some regard, but we also have aquifers where maybe only 2 countries overlap with a basin, or then of course the aquifers where there's no overlap with a basin, or where there's no basin organizations in place. And I think we have here an additional layer of mismatch. Normally we speak of a mismatch between administrative boundaries and hydrological boundaries that we somehow have to manage through integrated water management. But here we have another kind of adding a third dimension that we have to deal with, and that coupled with the political issues, I think adds an additional challenge that we only start to really grasp now.
Thank you very much. Any further? Yes, next question.
Yes, my name is Kevin Peterson from
Maybe we hand over the mic.
My name is Kevin Peterson from SADC GMI. My question relates, maybe Suzanne and the representative from UNICE can maybe answer this. The whole issue, I think it was made in a presentation around subnational institutional arrangement, because groundwater at the end of the day is very a local matter, and sometimes the transboundary issues or agreements and whatever doesn't trickle down to that in terms of, is there good lessons around that, because that's what we grappling with now, trying to understand those lessons, particularly as it relates to alluvial aquifer systems, because those aquifer systems follow international boundaries in many cases, and people use so the transboundary impact on those aquifer systems are real, and it affects communities, and borderland communities are frequently the most marginalized communities. And how do we kind of trickle down, so that it has impact at that level?
Okay, speaking about the different levels, who would like to respond?
Thank you. And I think that generally in transboundary water management, this issue is coming up more and more, that how do we link the basin organization or basin agreements to the actual communities on the ground. Several basin organizations, I believe, are making more and more efforts in this regard, but it's also not easy, because especially in large basins, that's why we have sub-basin organizations in several parts around the world. But for example, I think the Senegal Basin Development Organization, they have this Commission Permanente des Eaux, where they permanent water commission, where they actually involve users and to some extent at least, or in the Niger Basin Authority, they have the national focus, but also national commissions. So and several user organizations are permanently involved in the work of the basin organization. I think there are some good practice in this regard, but there is also much more still to be done and to be discussed, and good practices to be collected from around the world. I also wanted to briefly come back to the earlier question, where certainly it's a challenge, as you have said, but on the other hand, we can also see the benefits of cases where the countries have really come together and have jointly decided to manage the shared water resources jointly. I mean, for example, between Switzerland and France, they have more than 40 years already the Disi Aquifer agreement. Also in Latin America, on the Guarani, the countries have working for some time together, and the Guarani agreement is now just come into force recently. Or in Western Africa, we see the benefits. But this is why it is also very important, and some of the lessons learned, which we I think have learned in the Senegal Maritime Aquifer case, but also in other cases. Firstly, the importance of involving political actors early on in the start. So, for example, the ministers were very engaged from the early process and had to nominate members of the regional working group I mentioned earlier on. So to have a clear linkage between expert level and higher level political level, but also then the empowering of countries. So, for example, this regional working group, which I mentioned earlier on, is chaired by the countries, supported by UNECE and Geneva Water and IGRAC, but chaired by the countries. And then, yeah, this ensuring the close coordination between the surface water and aquifer, which in the case of the Senegal Meta Aquifer is not so easy because it cuts that basin, that groundwater basin cuts across the two basin organizations, Senegal and Gambia. So Gambia Basin Development Organization. So they themselves have to come together to agree on how to work together. But still, as in the case of Orasicom, the countries consider it as most useful to nest the cooperation mechanism within the existing basin organizations. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Susanne, do you want to add to the question on the interplay?
I can maybe just briefly add, I think, two brief points. I mean, ultimately, it's always a multi-level endeavor that, based on the subsidiarity principle, should be as close to the communities as possible. But then if there are transboundary impacts, of course, we have to address them at the transboundary level. But I think what we sometimes forget is when we talk between basin organizations and community is what's in between, and that's the national level. And if the willingness or the capacity is not there at the national level to actually address these issues, I think then the basin organization can be as active as it wants in order to engage local people. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions? I see the gentleman in the back, and maybe just for our online participants, it would be actually helpful if you used a microphone. Thanks.
Thank you. Gabriel Eckstein with Texas A&M University and the International Water Resources Association. So I have a governance question. The purpose of this session is to highlight groundwater and to encourage the prioritization of groundwater. When we're talking about transboundary cooperation, though, the idea is to set up, to promote some kind of organization to help facilitate and focus on that transboundary water body. But there seems to be almost a preference for these river basin organizations, RBOs. At least that's what I'm sensing here and elsewhere. And I'm worried about the prioritization. And I'm wondering what you think about in terms of how do we prioritize groundwater if we do in fact go to these RBOs for management, for governance, and maybe even in the Stampriet, I'm wondering, how do you look at the Stampriet aquifer in relation to the Orange and to the larger the river basin there, and make sure that the river isn't the priority over the critically important groundwater resources.
There you go.
Yes, and perhaps it's perception and many other aspects. But I think when we talk quantities, that's another element, because the idea, for at least for the water ministry, is to look at the water resources and see how do we benefit the most from the water resources that we draw or that we own through this river system. So my colleagues and myself, of course, we pay a lot of attention to the surface water, simply because the quantities of water involved, which can be utilized for many economic benefits, livelihoods, ecological benefits, and so on and so forth, tend to be larger in terms of scale. I think the countries, well, I can speak on Africa, they come together also because of the economies of scale. You look at some of the smaller economies. I mean, Lesotho, it happens to be my country, so I can say it's small. It wouldn't be able to build the kind of infrastructure for storage of water as it's doing now with cooperation, cooperating with its neighboring countries. So many of our states would not be able to harness the large amounts of surface water which is there without working with their neighbors. So I think we should understand that as well. I've worked on the groundwater side. Yes, groundwater is there, and you can supply the small villages all over by punching wells here and there. If you are lucky and you reach a reliable and dependable aquifer, which is broad in terms of geographic space, then you are able to really share the aquifer in that way. But the amounts and the calculations involved, I'll say the error margin. The error margin in the calculations involved is quite substantial. Like I said, the limiting factor to a large degree also has to do with punching the well or drilling the borehole. How deep can you go? I know in Lesotho, I think the deepest borehole is around 180 or 190 meters. I was involved in that at some stage. But you go to, I think, Namibia, what are you talking, 800 meters or more? Something like this. And in Botswana, you're talking about 300 meters or more. So understanding the aquifer below your feet also is restricted by how much you can research or you can drill. So I think these are the kinds of understandings that we should permit our scientific colleagues to dig into and try to make us understand a bit more, so that when we talk about groundwater, we are more confident than we are now. And I think the bias to surface water is that we tend to be more confident about the water that we see and that we can measure. But the groundwater is a bit tricky from that point. But if you want to talk science, we can speak for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lenka, would you like to add something?
Thank you for this very good question. And I believe it depends on the cases in each basin. In the MENA region, for example, obviously there's much higher focus on transboundary groundwater, and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, they did conclude the agreement under Disi, which is particularly on groundwater. And in other cases, in my belief, it's up to the countries to discuss and decide. There is also a matter of sustainability of organizations which are being created. It's important from the beginning on to consider whether a newly created organization can sustain itself over the longer term. And that's, I believe, why some of the countries have decided to rather host the mechanism in the existing basin organizations. But it is true that, as you say, then the basin organizations also need to dedicate some specific time and resources and potentially create specific working groups and so on. So yeah, it would be nice. I don't know if there are also some country representatives here. It would be nice also to hear their views. But maybe Susanna wants to add also something.
I just want to add one sentence that might sound very disillusioned, but I think one of the main reasons is that the lessons we've learned with creating basin organizations and the difficulties around them just makes people at the practical political level think, let's try to integrate that new thing into basin organizations wherever we can and not set up something new because it's just been such a pain. Might not be the best hydrological way to do it, but.
Thank you. And just one remark, our online panelist, Mr. Dodo, is hopefully still connected. If he at any point wants to come in, I'm just waiting for a sign from the technical support team. With that, we would still have time for an additional question if there is one on the floor. Nope. And oh, yes, very good.
Thank you very much, Maria. Maria Amakali from Namibia. I'm also part of the Orange Senku River Basin Commission, and we are jointly managing the Stampede Aquifer. As a practitioner, my main concern is how much water is available for everybody. And we always look at the connectivity of the systems to make it transboundary. But when we are allocating water equitably, we are saying how much water is available for everybody. Should I still look at the connectivity, or should I look at the whole area of the basin and say, for the number of people who are here, if I can get it from the groundwater system, which is not always connected, but falls within the basin, what are the formula I should use? If somebody can use the surface water, and if somebody can use the groundwater, connect it or not. Because communities, they are also connected to one way or the other in any country or in any system. So really the question is, should we keep focusing on the connectivity, the terminus, or do we look at the area and how we can allocate water in the system, in an area? I don't know.
Thank you. I'm looking at our panelists, and anybody would like to?
I will delegate it to somebody else. But yes, I think it's a big challenge because Maria, the other element, I guess, is whether some countries can be, encouraged to use only groundwater because that's what they have access to, while others have access to surface water as well. Because if you look at some of the solutions we are trying to work on in the orange, in some cases, we are even talking about transferring water from the better endowed regions to the drier areas, the Lesotho Botswana water transfer. Now, whether that then changes the whole dynamic of allocation of water resources, I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to this, because me and her, we are probably going to be interrogating this question much longer because we are in the same organization. I don't know.
If you like this. Thank you, Lenka. Yeah, I think, as you say, it depends also very much on the situation in each basin. But generally, we haven't heard much in this session today, but we actually are talking about conjunctive use of surface and groundwater management, which I believe is exactly the concept where we are aiming to look at those issues together. And with regards to water allocation, I mean, under the Water Convention has been prepared an intergovernmental process, a handbook on transboundary water allocation, which exactly brings together case studies from around the world, including Orange, but also many others. But also, and there it has been stressed that such water allocation arrangements have to be adaptable and also take into account climate change. And I think this is maybe another issue which we have not yet been discussing a lot. It was mentioned at the beginning of the session by the World Bank director, but obviously with climate change now more and more affecting surface water and groundwater, but the importance of groundwater usage will become even higher in the future. But on the other hand, also it's become more and more crucial to ensure the longer term sustainability of the use. So yeah, maybe Susanna wants to add anything, or maybe somebody else has some other questions.
I can add, but I don't necessarily want to take the time for questions. I think, Maria, what you're pointing to is, for me, very much kind of a short-term versus long-term decision-making question, right? Are we going for the easiest options, and not only in terms of management, but also as Lenka was saying earlier, in terms of what we know, we tend to manage what we know more and earlier than others, or are we really engaging in a comprehensive planning for an area that might be a surface and groundwater basin connected or not, in a sense that's looking ahead, okay, what do we have groundwater resources, what do we have water, surface water resources, and how do we deal with them in the future? And I think that's lacking in, well, probably most, if not all parts of the world still.
Thank you. We would have time for one final question if there is one on the floor. No, and there is one online. Maybe if that person online could speak up.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
We don't.
Yes,
Mr. Doro.
Yes, I think we cannot manage what we don't know. This year is about making visible the invisible, and your big title about World Water Week is Seems Unseen. And this is a big challenge. Okay, we're talking about management, how we can use, how we can abstract water resources. Because of the climate change, the big negative impact of climate change in water resources, mainly surface. were focusing on groundwater. But I insist, in the African continent, a lot of groundwater or transborder. You have a shared water resources. If we like to avoid conflict between countries, not at local level, really we need focus on improving knowledge. You cannot imagine, really, we're destroying our environment because of the lack of knowledge about our water resources. We're developing with India, Niger Basin, or how you say, Niger Basin Authority, you know, and cooperation between this big project, how you say, financed by Jeff, about the conjunctive management. This is what we're doing now, and we try to develop it in the continent. For instance, about Senegal, Mauritania aquifer system. As Sonja said, you have some countries sharing surface but not groundwater. Some others sharing groundwater but not surface. And we need, you know, to invite everybody and to see the best way really to manage. But before doing it, we cannot manage if we don't know what we have. Really, this is my key message. Thanks.
Knowledge was one of the key words here, and we hope this little Q&A helped you to understand better some of the issues we tackled up on. Before we close the session, I would like to hand over for some final words to Anders.
Thank you. I have this one.
Okay, you have that one.
Good. But let's give a big hand to the panelists. Thank you. So I think we're doing well on time, and I will make sure we end before time. Just a few thoughts from this. I think it was an incredibly rich discussion, and my feeling is that this discussion is only beginning. In certain circles, it's been going on for a while, and there's been advocates for working on transboundary groundwater longer. And finally, I think we are listening better than before. With basins closing, with climate change, as was highlighted, the focus will have to turn to groundwater, which is often then transboundary. And this will be important for economic growth, for jobs, for GDP development, but also for peace and stability. And unless we address this, countries' developments will be put into questions, and even regions. So it's the onus is on I think all of us here to try to work on this in a comprehensive fashion, whether it's in research, policy, financing, and so on. Another takeaway that I carry with me is that more knowledge is needed. It's of course much more research. We heard it from multiple sources here. To improve our understanding of this, because as Mr. Dodo was highlighting, we can't manage what we don't know. And also, apart from the research and the knowledge generation, I think capacity building of countries and institutions, whether it's ministries and others, is also a key aspect. And I think also the question of sort of institutional development, the question really was highlighted by, I think, Gabriel, one of the people asking a question. Where does this question sit best? And Susanna was saying, pragmatically, perhaps in RBOs in some cases, because it's painful to establish a new institution. And that may work, but in other cases it won't work, and then other institutions are needed to be established. But how to do that best, I think we're still looking for answers to that. So again, this is a beginning of a conversation, and I would like to thank everyone online and everyone in the room, and please interact with us at the World Bank, the Cooperation in International Waters in Africa program, which I'm the manager of. We will continue to increase our focus on this. We're already working a bit, but we see the scope to increase this a lot more. So thank you, everyone, and I hereby close this event and wish you good rest of the day. Thank you.